Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the Sabbat World's Crusade, where the Imperial Crusade under War Master Macaroths finds itself in quite the pickle. Overextended and now stuck against a solid defensive line that there appeared to be no immediate hope of overcoming, it appeared for all the world like Macaroths' charging bull strategy, his race for the horizon, had run into a solid brick wall, and now had its neck exposed. A weakness that the arch-enemy was not slow to take advantage of. Fortunately for the Crusade, the northernmost edge of the Chaos counter-thrust aimed towards the planet of Hagir, the Saints' homeworld, had been halted, well, in essence annihilated in fact, by the ancient superweapon apparently left on the planet by Saint Sabbat's foresight. This miraculous intervention from the past probably saved the Crusade right then and there, as the War Master Macaroth was still, of course, as mentioned, fully committed in the Cabal system, with no clue that his lines of communications were about to be placed under tremendous threat. But the scattering of this major Chaos force gave him at least a little bit of breathing room, although not a whole lot. Immediate counterattacks needed to be initiated along the northern edge of the Crusade's overextended flank, both to forestall any further Chaos attempts at offensives in the north aimed towards severing Macaroth's only connection to the rest of the Sabbat worlds now, but also to secure vital local supplies. At the moment, all of the War Master's vital resources, ammunition, raw material, and fuel, were being sourced either from the far coreward worlds of the Sabbat worlds, like the newly conquered planet of Verghast, for example, although it would take quite some time before its industrial output reached its old standards, and the rest of the supplies required came from the coreward worlds themselves, bordering the Sabbat sector. It was an enormous length of space to be covered. Now, when the original plan was to break through the Cabal system quickly and then finish the conquest of the Sabbat worlds, this overextended supply line was a minor inconvenience, a risk, but a worthwhile one. Now, however, that the Crusade was suddenly brought to a complete halt and those supply lines were under threat, now they were no longer an inconvenience. They were a knife at the Crusade's throat. If the enemy managed to organize sufficient raiding forces, as they had in the form of the Vehedwak naval elements in the early stages of the war, then the War Master Macaroth may very well find himself forced to assault enemy fortress complexes on an empty stomach and with naught but a bayonet. It was vital, therefore, to secure more localized supplies. One of the earliest immediate targets for this was the world of Phantine, as its vapor mills would provide a crucial supply of promethium. The planets beyond, like Lyubov, would then be assaulted to secure the Crusade's flank, and Urdesh, at the moment still in Chaos hands, would be reached by Imperial naval elements in the early months of 772, although the planet would remain a battle zone for many years hence. It is therefore the desperate struggle for simple survival of the Imperial Crusade that we are going to concern ourselves with primarily over the course of the next couple of videos, with today's focusing particularly on Phantine, followed by the war being waged on the southern end of the Imperial lifeline, in essence. But first, we should take a brief deviation and talk about the Chaos Forces, for after all, they appeared to be broken. Their inevitable demise seemed to have been set in stone. And yet now, it was the Crusade that was facing down imminent annihilation. How had things changed so quickly and so decisively? To explain that, we need to have a look at the arch-enemy's command structure, and the fact that it was not as shattered after Balhut as Imperial intelligence had suggested. As we talked about previously, the assumption was that the arch-enemy's forces would spend years looking for a successor to the Archon Nadzibar, that he himself had claimed the position of supreme leader of all the Chaos Forces in the Sabbat worlds only after a decades-long crusade against all the other leaders, binding them to him either through submission or pacts of alliances, marriage, commitment, or ritual. As a Chaos alliance of this scale is not simply just a military alliance, it is based on familial bonds. It is based on clans, on oaths, on rituals, on obligations, and acts of sacrifice and dominance. Not to mention mutual benefit. The Vahedwak naval elements, for example, were largely tied to Archon Nadzibar by bonds of tribute. The Archon offered them slaves, he offered them fume, resources, and captured warships, enough for them in turn to offer to transport his armies across the void, to protect his warriors in space, and to raid his enemies for him. To put it somewhat simplistically, the entire arch-enemy alliance in the Sabbat worlds was one enormous, unfathomably complex spiderweb of everything from simple interlocking interests to religious adherence to bonds of fealty, etc., 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 etc. It therefore seemed entirely reasonable for Imperial intelligence to assume that no one could simply step into the position of Archon, and in any other case that would have been correct. I mean, hell, remember, even the Imperium, with a relatively clear line of succession, announced by the previous War Master himself on his deathbed, struggled for months to achieve a real sense of unity. And it wasn't until very, very recently, now somewhat undermined by current events, that War Master Macaroth felt confident in the loyalty of his generals. So how possibly then could a Chaos leader have emerged so quickly? Well, two reasons. One, the simplest language for all Chaos worshippers to understand: brutality, violence, and martial might. And secondly, the same reason why the Imperials had to rally behind Macaroth: necessity. Without a firm leader, the arch-enemy's time in the Sabbat worlds was as good as over. Just like as for the Imperials, without a leader, it would be impossible to drive forward the advantage gained at Balhut. Now, that did not mean that there weren't ample contestants, of course. The Chaos Forces did indeed descend into intersign warfare for a period, but remarkably enough, this period, known as the Pact Wars, only lasted for a measly 8 months. I remind you again that Imperial intelligence assumed that it was unlikely that a leader could rise at all, and if one could be found, it would be years and years before he'd achieve any sort of unity amongst the disparate tribes and forces of the Sabbat worlds. And yet, a relatively unknown warlord, at least to Imperial intelligence's eyes, Urlock Gaur, did just that in less than a year. Now, there had been some evidence to his rise. During their early advance into the rest of the Sabbat worlds, the Imperium had discovered several planets that had very clearly played host to major battles, but having just arrived, the Imperials obviously were not responsible for them. This was viewed simply as further evidence that the Chaos forces were fracturing, and were now falling upon one another at a remarkable rate. But instead, they told the tale of Urlock Gaur's Blood Pact cutting a swath through all who would stand against him, and making grisly examples of them to boot, demonstrating not only the self-evident martial superiority of his Blood Pact elite, but also that he was not intent on taking any prisoners. He had declared himself Archon, and any who disagreed would only do so whilst coughing up their own vital fluids. Swiftly, then, Urlock Gaur established for himself a prominent position amongst the competitors for the title of Archon. The only one seemingly capable of challenging him was Anakvanar Sek. We've talked about him earlier as well, as Imperial intelligence assumed that he would be the most likely candidate to unify the Chaos forces, due to the simple fact that he possessed the single largest private army, and held sovereign control over the largest swaths, intelligence guessed, over the remaining Chaos-held worlds of the Sabbat sector. It would undoubtedly take him a very long time, but he would, if given that time, crush his competitors one by one by one, underneath the unrivaled might of his steamroller armies. This was a large part of the reason why Macaroth elected to go for his mad dash towards the horizon, to preempt the rise of a traditional warlord like Anakvanar Sek. Sek, however, was far too clever for that. He recognized what Macaroth was doing, and he understood that if he threw all of his forces in the way of the War Master, then he would fatally weaken his own efforts to become Archon, thus halting neither the Imperium nor his competitors. In fact, if he were to do so, he would simply be offering himself up as a sacrificial lamb, to be assaulted from both the front and the rear at once. Simultaneously, if he attempted to first subdue the warlords, then Macaroth's mad dash would probably leave Anakvanar Sek with nothing more than a relatively minor sliver of the Sabbat worlds to perch upon, until the War Master would turn his overwhelming attention against him. It appeared to be a lose-lose situation, where no matter which way the Magister turned, he would be doomed to failure. Unless, of course, there was somebody else out there already subjugating the lesser warlords, and at a impressive speed as well. Now, in a war between Urlock Gaur and Anakvanar Sek, my money would undoubtedly be on Sek, but the Magister immediately recognized that whilst he could probably defeat the Gaur, it would be a bloody and long war that would leave neither side able to resist the Imperium. Now, Gaur was a beast, a classic barbarian warlord of chaotic descent, an animal in essence, but an able animal, an apex predator, clearly more than capable of subduing the other predators around him. A valuable ability. a virtue even, but like most powerful animals, the Gaur also had his pride. Far too much of it. He was the kind of creature that would happily die at a hunter's feet so long as he at the least got to bloody his claws first. Such a creature could only be defeated either by an overwhelming, irresistible show of force, the kind that even a beast's brain could understand, switching pride to survival and submission. Sek very much so doubted he could muster that kind of force right now, and certainly not whilst also fending off the Imperium at the same time. But whilst the Magister was certainly a monster in his own way, he was a far more cunning creature, capable of seeing a future beyond petty pride. Sek would deal with the Gaur later. For now, he needed him. And if the only way to get good use out of this animal was to pretend to submit to it, then so be it. Besides, the Blood Pact had proved itself a most fascinating subject for study. The Magister's own armies were of the classical cult variety, relying on religious fanaticism and overwhelming numbers to carry the day. But here was a force that demonstrated that one could utilize both fanaticism and military acumen at the same time. There were lessons to be learned here, and now that he had allied himself to the Gaur, Anakwana Sek would have ample time to learn them. This uneven, uneasy, and highly unusual alliance, then, was the reason why the arch-enemy's forces had been able to mount this massive, organized counterattack at a time when the Imperium still believed the enemy to be leaderless and unorganized. By the time that the War Master's intelligence-gathering apparatus began to understand the mistake they had made, it was of course all too late to do anything about it. The War Master's forces were fully committed to the Cabal offensive. Even if the War Master had wanted to retreat right now, it was an impossibility. He had been able to move all of these troops, all of their naval elements, all of their supplies, all of their armor, all of their commanders up only as the culmination of a long and hyper-complicated process. Even if the enemy were inclined to not do anything about it, and they were unlikely to be so cooperative, merely just moving all of the Imperial forces out of the Cabal system and back to, say, Khan 3 and 4, and reassembling an Imperial line there, just the simple transference of such a huge amount of troops and materiel would take months to plan. And that was assuming the War Master again would be allowed to focus on the task. And then it would take months to execute, quite probably years, as the enemy again would be unlikely to simply sit idly by, watching as the Imperials began to withdraw. The War Master's undesirable and yet nevertheless most logical choice was to continue to fight, in an effort to try and break the backbone of the Chaos forces in the Cabal system, forcing the enemy to reallocate resources away from their offensives towards the defensive action in the Cabal system, and relying on the second and third line commanders to keep the War Master alive. Now, fortunately for him, his earlier interest in replacing many of the old stars that had enjoyed prominence and success under War Master Slado, and replacing them instead with Macaroth's own preferred men, would now bear unsuspected fruit. The second and third line formations, the commands that many of these veteran commanders had been relegated to open up slots for Macaroth's own men, were now occupied by veteran, experienced, skilled generals like, for example, Van Voytz, who would now be leading the invasion of the world of Phantine, where vital Imperial promethium supplies could hopefully be secured. And it was going to be a very good thing indeed that this operation would be commanded by a veteran general like Van Voytz, as Phantine was a military strategist's and tactician's worst nightmare. The world of Phantine was an industrial planet, now most well known and valued for countless vapor mills that produced enormous quantities of promethium. These had been in the hands of the Chaos Invaders for quite some time now, and were pumping out their resources to fuel the Gaur's resurgent war machine. The Imperium therefore had to retake them and, if at all possible, retake them intact. This is already a complicated enough undertaking. Seizing a massive promethium refinery filled with highly explosive flammable gases and liquids is a challenging and delicate undertaking at the best of times. Phantine, however, was not the best of times. After millennia of heavy industrial exploitation, the planet had been rendered virtually unlivable. Imperial civilization still clung on, but only to the absolute highest peaks of mountains, where enormous sky fortresses had in essence been created to continue the production of promethium. These tiny, entirely isolated mountaintop holdfasts were what Van Voytz now had to invade. And there was no margin for error here. Underneath them was an area known to the locals as the Scald. This was the atmosphere of the remainder of the planet, which was entirely covered in burning acidic gas. There was, quite simply, no existing in the Scald. There was no troop movements possible through it. There were no way to scale the mountains themselves. There were no way to establish logistical corridors on the planet's surface. Everything had to be done via air power. All troop movements had to be carried out via vast dirigible airships. All assaults needed to be launched entirely via the air. And all troop resupply and logistics also had to be organized via the air. To put it somewhat crudely, just living on Phantine sucked a lot of ass. Waging war on Phantine, well, it was going to provide Van Voytz with many sleepless nights. And as a reward for their excellent performance on Hagia, the Tanith, first and only, would be sent to Phantine right alongside Van Voytz. And to be fair, this was actually a deployment that made a relative degree of sense for the Tanith first and only. Being a light infantry formation without any heavy machinery or heavy pieces of gear beyond the occasional heavy bolter and rocket launcher, they were ideally suited to be airdropped. Now, naturally, their expertise as scouts and infiltrators would be, less valuable, but hey, you can't have everything, now can you? At least there was going to be a mild covert element to the first operation that the Tanith would be involved in on Phantine, the attack on Cirenholm. Now, Cirenholm was one of many of these in essence floating cities scattered across the surface of Phantine, a major refinery building consisting of both industrial complexes and housing domes. In more peaceable times, Cirenholm had been considered a fairly nice city by Phantine standards, housing over 200,000 people in relative luxury, actually, as it was considered one of the more well-off cities, mountaintops, remaining on the planet. But Cirenholm was of course not targeted due to the relative opulence of its civilian accommodations. Rather, it was targeted for two reasons. Firstly, that it would provide the Imperials with, in essence, a dry run for more ambitious operations. And secondly, because it lay directly south of Uranberg, the Phantine capital. The capital had fallen to chaos quite some while ago. There were still elements of PDF resistance on Phantine, as the world had proven as difficult for chaos to conquer as it would be for the Imperium to reconquer it. This at least gave Van Voytz a jumping-off point, and hopefully the seizure of Uranberg as the second major part of his operation would in essence cut off the Chaos Force's head on the planet, denying them access to the largest, most important city, and crucially, its promethium production, as the Imperium could then both secure the vital resource for themselves and deny it to Chaos. But before we get to Uranberg, we first have to conquer the stepping stone that is Cirenholm. And the aforementioned covert aspect of the assault is that it was to be a night attack, intended, hopefully so, to catch the enemy by surprise. The attack was slated to go ahead just before midnight. Imperial transports would arrive as silently as any airborne vehicle could, and suddenly, out of the blackened night sky, depositing Urdeshi Stormtrooper regiments and the Tanith first and only directly onto the Cirenholm domes and landing platforms via fast roping. Which, in case you are unaware, is the process of, jumping out of a hovering vehicle attached to nothing more than a rope, and a pulley mechanism which will, if everything goes well, slow one's descent from terminal to merely bone jarring. Short of jumping out of an aircraft and parachuting in, this would be the quickest way to deploy the troops onto Cirenholm. And whilst I'm sure the Guard considered the paratroop option, with the constant high-altitude winds being as powerful and as unpredictable as they were, and the fact that missing the landing point would mean guaranteed death, even the Imperial Guard has some risks that it is unwilling to take with its manpower. Do not make the mistake, however, of thinking that fast roping would somehow be safe. Oh, hell no. You now have dozens of Imperial Guardsmen without the ability to defend themselves, as their weapons will be fastened to their persons so as to not simply be dropped or fall off during the fast roping procedure, hanging via ropes, in many cases up to 30 or 50 meters long, dangling in the air from stationary transport vehicles, making a whole lot of noise. And any of Cirenholm's defenders that decided to poke their heads out of a window at the time would be presented with a veritable shooting gallery. Even so, however, it was decided that it was worth a try, and that it was the method most likely to succeed, as you might think that the best way to start this would be with an attack by air vehicles, by aircraft. You could simply have atmospheric fighters zoom in ahead of the transports, firing dumbfire rocket pods at the outside of Cirenholm, whilst you have Valkyries on standby, firing yet more rockets, autocannons, and heavy bolter shells into the side of Cirenholm. and there would be some fire support elements on station, but there were two problems with this. One, tossing a whole heaping heck of a lot of dumbfire projectiles at a vapor mill is an interesting proposition. And anything staying on station for long enough to make sure that it can be absolutely certain of not hitting something that would go truly kabloomy would be hovering relatively still in the air in front of a city's worth of anti-air batteries. Yeah, there were some challenges. But hopefully, if the Imperials could achieve tactical surprise, they'd be able to neutralize the largest part of the danger by getting into Cirenholm, attacking the defensive batteries, and overwhelming the defenders before a truly effective defense could be mounted. That, at least, was the theory. To make sure that the defenders would be unable to figure out what the Imperials were up to and where all of their landing zones were, the Imperial officers were forbidden from bringing any maps onto the battlefield, beyond those who would be carried, of course, by command personnel. Notably, Colonel Commissar Ibrahim Gaunt decided to ignore this order and hand out maps to many of his platoon leaders. And it was pretty damn lucky that he did as well. But we'll get to that later, as there were other problems in store for the Tanith First and Only as well. You see, organizing a war on this kind of a scale, a system scale, is a damnably difficult undertaking. Even just making sure that food and fuel and lube and everything get to the front line is a ridiculous, absurdly mind-boggling job. You have millions and millions and millions of guardsmen requiring everyday necessities on a dozen different worlds. And you need to meet all of those by dispatching ships that can take weeks or months to actually get to their destination. And you've got to make sure that all of those troops have everything they need in between supply runs, or organizing enough supply ships to keep up a continuous supply. What I'm trying to allude to here is that it's very, very, very goddamn difficult to do this, and so snafus are unavoidable. One such snafu occurred at Cirenholm, when the Tanith First and Only noticed, much to their butt-clenching distress, I am sure, that they had been issued with the incorrect size power packs for their las rifles. The Tanith First and Only used size 3. They had been issued with size 5. The entire Imperial assault force had been issued with size 5. Because the logistical officers had simply been instructed to take aboard standard pattern power packs. A standard pattern power pack on Phantine is, you guessed it, a size 5. And since the entire assault force was already aboard their dirigibles, and there was literally no land around, or resupplies for days, that meant that the Tanith First and Only was shit out of luck. Luckily, like good Imperial guardsmen, the Tanith too had been scrounging away power packs for quite some time. Every good soldier knows that when you're going into battle, you bring however much ammunition you can fit onto your person, as running out of it is a very, very bad time indeed. On many occasions, they wouldn't actually use all of it and would simply store it away for a rainy day. Well, if you look outside your window right now, you will note that it is indeed raining. And so, due to the colloquial wisdom of the average Imperial guardsman's pathological need to stow away anything and everything useful, the Tanith would not go into battle with nothing, but dangerously close to nothing. But there would be no calling off or delaying the assault. Surprise was paramount, and the Imperials were already pushing their luck quite a bit beyond the breaking point here. The Tanith would simply just have to make do as they boarded their transports and headed for Cirenholm, where pretty much immediately everything went wrong, because misery does so adore company. Although, to be fair, it could easily have gone a lot worse than it did, thanks to the intuition of Umbra Leader, a fighter flight commander by the name of Bree Yagda, who ended up saving a lot of Imperial lives when she, on a hunch, based on the fact that an overdue flight of marauders had not yet reported in, decided to carry out one more fighter sweep of the area before pulling back away from Cirenholm. This allowed her to slot in and engage a flight of enemy fighters, just as they began their attack runs on the Imperial transports. The fighters would destroy several transports, killing hundreds of men, but had they been allowed to continue unchallenged, the entire assault might very well have been obliterated in the air before the first Imperial Guardsman ever managed to set foot upon Cirenholm proper, at the very least in any numbers worth dropping. And even this was not the only misfortune suffered by the attackers this day, or night more correctly. Due to the low light conditions and the need to approach in complete darkness, many of the transports were operating near exclusively on instruments alone. Now, flying by instrument is one of the more advanced things a pilot needs to learn, and many, apparently, had not learned this quite as well as they should have. Many of the transports came in too high, dropping their Imperial Guardsmen off well above the deck they were supposed to be hitting, causing all sorts of injuries as people fell off the rope and found that they still had 10 meters left to go until they actually impacted on Cirenholm. And even they were the lucky ones. At least they would only have some sprains, maybe some broken legs here and there. There was one, the 1M flight of the Urdeshi Stormtrooper invasion force. Well, it pulled up 50 meters short of the platform, meaning that every man aboard slipped down the ropes into the dark night, unable to see anything, and then slipped off the rope and straight into the scald, killing every single man aboard. Even the Tanith were not entirely immune to mishaps either. Now, luckily for the Tanith, their landing zone was not quite as exposed as the Urdeshi. The Urdeshi were intended to land in far greater numbers and had therefore been given the more difficult objective, and they should have had adequate force to take it. But then in came the fighters and reduced their adequate force quite significantly. The Tanith were a pinch luckier, but they too were placed under heavy fire the moment they attempted to disembark their transports. The enemy had not been anywhere near as surprised as Van Voytz had hoped for, and were firing up at the transports now in ever-increasing numbers. There were even fighters down on the platforms, the intended landing zones. This caused a major snafu, which would end up being a rather useful one. Major Rawn, coming in Transport 2P, elected to not immediately disembark from his transport when ordered to do so, because of enemy fighters waiting for him on the landing platform down below. Instead, he gathered up a whole hipping heck of a lot of grenades and explosives, tossed them out of the window, and cleared the landing platform in an improvised yet effective fashion. This allowed his forces to land relatively safely, but it also meant that his transport remained on station significantly longer than it should have, causing all of the other incoming transports to need to suddenly stop instead of continuing in a smooth basis, depositing further troops. Some of the transports managed to stop in time, others did not. This was the fate of Transport 2K. It, needing to immediately readjust itself, overshot the landing zone, which was a better option than simply crashing into the transports ahead of it. It would at this point be suicidal to try and turn around and rejoin the queue, and so standard operating procedure suggested that the transport should then break away and head back to the dirigibles. This was not an option, however, as the transport had been hit coming in, and fuel pressure was rapidly dropping. This forced the transport and the squads on board to ditch directly on to Cirenholm. Or more correctly, to crash into Cirenholm, or hopefully crash into Cirenholm, as it was pitch black outside and they couldn't see anything. Luckily, again, in comes Flight Commander Bree Yagda to the rescue. She had been shot down just a little bit before and had fell down onto Cirenholm with her parachute, or flotation device more correctly, as traditional parachutes of course would be rather pointless on a planet with a toxic atmosphere. She, seeing 2K approach, pulled out an emergency flare and illuminated a landing area. 2K then crashed into Cirenholm, rather than flying off the edge and dumping all of the men aboard into the Scald. The transport then, however, began sliding down the side of Cirenholm, pulling the Imperial Guardsmen on board with it as they were all attached to the rappelling ropes. This really was an unfortunate expedition for the Tanith and everybody else involved, frankly. It dragged several soldiers down with it into the Scald, but about 31 Imperial Guardsmen, along with their commanders, still remained, although they were now trapped on Cirenholm, outside, with no idea where to go, in the toxic atmosphere with only their gas masks to protect them. Luckily, Gaunt had disobeyed the order to not issue maps to any of his subordinates, so they at least, in theory, knew how to get inside of Cirenholm. In the main drop zones, it was, well, just kind of getting worse. You starting to see a pattern beginning to develop with this whole assault operation. Yeah, somehow a sticky situation just kept getting stickier and a shitty one kept getting shittier, all across the front line. If it wasn't one thing, it was another, as the Imperial soldiers now began to recognize the nature of their foe. The few enemy warriors they'd been able to bring down, either by shooting them off the parapets of Cirenholm or defeating them on the landing platforms themselves, wore drab red battle garb, and, more tellingly, iron grotesques, marking them out unmistakably so as Blood Pact soldiers. Suddenly, the ferocity and professionalism of the defenders made a whole lot more sense. These weren't simple cultists that the Imperials were attacking. This was an equivalent force to themselves. And over the course of the next hour, the Imperials made very little progress, suffering heavy casualties as they tried to force an entry point against determined resistance. Eventually, both Urdeshi and Tanith element, while suffering heavy casualties, gained access to Cirenholm, when suddenly, even though they hadn't secured anything like a serious or telling breakthrough, the fighting stopped. The defenders disappeared and withdrew. Everything grew completely silent. Suspicious, but it could also be an incredible opportunity. Perhaps the enemy had made some sort of tactical mistake. Perhaps their morale had broken. This is always the difficult thing about command. How do you distinguish a trap from an opportunity? Bearing in mind that the latter will eventually vanish if not acted upon. Well, I'm sure it'll come as no particular surprise to you that this was the former, a trap, and the first indication of it was found by Daur of the Tanith First and Only. He quickly communicated his discovery to Commissar Hark, who had been attached to the Tanith after Hagia. What Daur had discovered were miniature void shield generators worked into the walls at certain intersections to cut off entrance into the city. Now, this was weird for many reasons. One, void shields, holy shit, those are supposed to be pretty rare, particularly the miniaturized variant. Two, why weren't they on? If they had been active, the Imperial advance would have been stopped dead, and yet they were powered. According to Daur's observations, they smelled of ozone, meaning that they were ready to go live at any moment. Commissar Hark immediately conveyed this message on to Ibrahim Gaunt, who then spread it to the rest of the Tanith, and quickly found that the rest of his officers had also noticed the same thing, the majority of whom had stopped upon finding them, with the exception of 3 command units that had gone too far beyond the gateways to be retreated at this point. These were the forces under Obel, Kolya, and Varel. These advanced assault elements had been moving faster than the rest of the Tanith first and only, and they had indeed been a large part of the reason why the Tanith were even inside of Cirenholm at all. But now they were dangerously exposed and separated from the rest of the forces, and growing more so as Ibrahim ordered a full halt to the Tanith's advance whilst he attempted to communicate with the Urdeshi Stormtroopers. Using the powerful Voytz caster pack, he managed to reach both of them in turn, first Falazur and then Zeit. He informed Falazur of the discovery, and he promised that he'd be on the lookout for further void shields, as the Urdeshi would continue to advance cautiously. He also reached Zeit, but Zeit, yelled at him. He didn't like the Tanith much, and honestly, the Urdeshi by and large were not happy to be here. They would much rather be advancing towards Urdesh itself, their homeworld, and be a part of its reconquest, instead of spilling their blood for promethium on Phantine. He told Gaunt where he could shove his void shields, and that was about the end of that, as mere moments thereafter, the void shields began to activate. They had been set up so as to cut several sections of the city into smaller, easily contained areas. Inside of these areas, the Blood Pact had not retreated, but gone to ground. They had hidden themselves behind false walls or under the floorboards themselves, in pre-made bolt holes. Now that the shields had been activated, and the Imperials were cut up into smaller groupings, the Blood Pact emerged from all around them, shooting and stabbing with rusted bayonets. In mere seconds, the Urdeshi and the Tanith were engaged in ferocious close-quarters fighting with an enemy that seemed to be coming out of the literal walls, and they had no opportunity to maneuver. They could not reorganize themselves or fall back to supporting positions. The various platoons were in essence fighting their own tiny little private battles, all by themselves, and many were swiftly becoming overwhelmed. The Urdeshi in particular, having pushed forward far more quickly than the Tanith, were in the real deep end of it. Having been surrounded, they were now getting slaughtered. The Tanith were only doing a little bit better, as they had managed to maintain more of their small unit cohesion. They were also expert hand-to-hand fighters, and knew that something was up, so they were prepared for the ambush when it happened. But the Tanith, of course, were running out of ammunition. The majority of the Tanith men at this point had a single magazine left, which, depending upon the capacity of their las rifles, would be something between 100 to 200 shots total. Not bad, but for an automatic weapon, that's less than half a minute's worth of continued fire. In a desperate situation like this, Gaunt couldn't do much as a commander. His forces were too separated, and microbead Vox traffic was basically impossible this close to this many active void shields. All he could do was swing his sword, the marvelous power weapon of Hieronymus Sonder given to him after his heroics at Vervunhive, and fire his bolt gun. He was one of the few individuals who still had plentiful ammo, as bolt guns of course don't take power packs. The Tanith, first and only, seemed to be at the end of their rope when his Vox officer Beltane told him that he had suddenly received a Vox transmission, high power, from inside of Cirenholm. Doma and his survivors had managed to gain entry into the city, gain access to a high-powered Vox beacon, and were now in communication with Gaunt, who informed them that void shields had been established all across the city, and they must be powered from the central city power supply. And Doma and his boys were the only ones who might stand a chance of getting to that supply and destroying it. Their new top priority mission. Doma and his men did indeed make it to the central power control section, but none of them were engineers, none of them were mechanics, none of them had ever operated a system like this, and they were now being cut off and overwhelmed by fanatic Blood Pact counterattack that realized that this was about to go very poorly for them very quickly, and they would probably have been overwhelmed and killed were it not for the other 3 Tanith units that had broken through, those from the command of Obel, Collier, and Var. They, having no real opposition in front of them, simply kept going forward towards what they believed to be the most vital objective, the power supply. They didn't even really know what was going on behind them, but Doma was more than happy to inform them, of course, and Collier, well, he had been a mine supervisor on Vervunhive. He had at least some idea how a power control system worked, and he was able to turn it off, turning the shields off in the process. Now finally able to communicate and coordinate again, the Tanith launched spirited counterattacks against their Blood Pact aggressors, and quickly began joining up with the other Tanith forces. No longer were they isolated platoons, once again they were a regiment driving forward, and the Blood Pact was unable to stand up to them. The Urdeshi eventually began to rally as well, though they had suffered massively during the shield's activation period. It would take another 6 hours before the entirety of Cirenholm was actually secured, as the Blood Pact defenders continued to fight to the very death for every inch of Cirenholm. But beyond the first 2 to 3, it became apparent that there were not enough of them left to offer serious resistance. The trap, then, had been an act of desperation, and ironically, it had also been the act that may very well have doomed the Blood Pact defenders. In the first hour, the Blood Pact had in essence got the Imperials pinned down on their landing sites. There were a handful of platoons here and there, primarily from the Tanith, that had managed to gain entry into Cirenholm, but they in and of themselves would have been unable to stand up to massed counterattacks. The Urdeshi had barely managed to breach the main domes, with the majority of their forces still exposed outside in the shooting gallery. Had the Blood Pact simply held on and defended the objective in a traditional manner, there is every chance they would have been able to win. But the Blood Pact commander had assumed that he was significantly more heavily outnumbered than he actually was, and thus had bet everything instead on a novel tactic. He had somehow managed to get his hand on void shield generators, and had elected instead to trick the Imperials deeper into Cirenholm, where he would partition them and assault them from point-blank range with de facto suicide troops. Then, once the enemy's command structure and cohesion had been completely shattered by the surprise attack, he would sweep in with his reserves after bringing down the void shields and cleaning up any remaining resistance. It was a bold and imaginative strategy, to be sure, which, against an actually larger force, without the moment of luck that Domer's infiltration and Kol Varl Obel's assault forces had created, might very well have worked even against an overwhelmingly large Imperial force. But due to his over-focus on the defenders and allowing them inside, by the moment the power went down, which would have been irrelevant had the Imperial still been trapped outside, he had dedicated too many of his troops for the suicide operation, and didn't have enough reserves, as they had been dispatched to try and hold the power generator, to stand up to the rapidly mounting attacks of the Imperials. Now caught under attack from two sides, and without a plan, the Blood Pact began to collapse, their troops being encircled into ever smaller areas of Cirenholm and killed piecemeal. This also allowed the Imperials to rescue the civilian populace. In all due likelihood, the Blood Pact had kept them for, well, labor, in essence, and had stowed them away, probably planning to kill them all if it appeared that they would lose the battle, but due to the sudden deterioration of everything, they were unable to do so, and they were also unable to carry out any major sabotage of Cirenholm's facilities. At the end of the day, then, it had been a successful assault. In fact, it would even be noted upon later by Imperial tactician Antonod Biota, one of the greatest tacticians of the Crusade, many would say after the Crusade was over, that it would be remembered as a glorious victory and forgotten that it was won on the edge of a knife. Which becomes even more apparent when one looks at the casualty figures. The Urdeshi had 1,200 dead and 900 wounded. That is a remarkable statistic, as normally, of course, the wounded will outnumber the dead by many times over. Imperial medical technology is nothing to sneeze at. But this was a signifier of the close-in brutality of the ambush against the Urdeshi. They had been caught far more unawares than the Tanith, and so had suffered far more casualties in the hand-to-hand combat, when the Blood Pact had ample opportunity to twist the knife, so to say. Meanwhile, the Tanith had suffered a total of 28 dead and 200 wounded. Surprisingly low numbers, everything considered, but they also hadn't been gutted by fighters whilst trying to unload their troops on Cirenholm. Small comfort, of course, for Van Voytz, who had lost nearly half of his two primary offensive regiments, with 2,100 casualties plus. In total, both formations had been crippled and probably rendered combat ineffective. Van Voytz was going to have to get a lot more creative with the assault on Uranberg if he wanted to avoid a repeat of this slaughter. And seeing as they now knew that Blood Pact forces were active on Phantine, and Uranberg would be a much larger objective, he was going to have to get creative if he wanted to avoid not just another slaughter, but an outright defeat. And in a theater like Phantine, it's not like a retreat from a losing battle was really an option either. Uranberg would have to be an all-or-nothing gamble, but at the very least, Van Voytz figured that he might be able to stack the deck a little bit more in his favor, and the Tanith person only, well, they had yet again made the crucial mistake of proving themselves capable. And in any military organization, if you demonstrate one time too many that you have a knack for doing the impossible, well, The impossible is the only task you will ever be assigned from that point onwards. Hard times ahead for Ibrahim Gaunt and the Tanith First and Only, but that will have to wait until next time. For now, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.